was always in a rush before to finish this project. Like Silicon Valley is just a very fast-paced place, and everyone's always getting the next milestone as fast as possible. I think for me, like the LinkedIn FOMO is as cringy as the LinkedIn feed can be. There's definitely FOMO there of like everyone's like succeeding at something, launching something new, or they just raise another round, and you feel like you're constantly behind. And so you're always in a rush to like make sure we hit some number by some date, but then trying to just take more time to make decisions and not be in a rush just really makes a big difference. Like just block off time to not do anything and make sure you don't feel guilty about it. Like that sense of guilt is just so overriding for, I think, a lot of founders. Like that's what drives you. I think it's good to have that guilt that really drives you and makes you work harder, but it's also poisonous if you let it take over.
I'm Alex Yang, and this is the How I Decided podcast, a show where regular people share important decisions they've made so that we can make better decisions in our own lives and also figure out what we want from our lives and how we want to live our 20s.
How I Decided.
And if you're new to the How I Decided podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow us on Spotify, and also on Instagram so that you can stay up to date on the newest episodes and spread the word about the importance of decision making in our 20s. My guest today is Arrel Gray. Arrel is the head of product at Primer, a startup backed by Founders Fund committed to building a new education system. Arrel was previously the co-founder of Wonderschool, an A16Z-backed startup helping teachers start great preschools, and also the co-founder of Soldsie and 17 Feet. Arrel clearly has an impressive track record as an entrepreneur, and there's a lot I could have asked about startup building, but in my initial conversation with getting to know him, I was actually more intrigued by his story about a 1-year break he took to Portugal after his time in Wonderschool. During that time, Arrel didn't work and focused his time on learning Portuguese and surfing. As someone like myself who feels guilty if I'm not doing work or being productive, I really wanted to know from Arrel why he chose to go on this break and what it did for him. In our conversation, Arrel and I discussed the temptation to only focus on the near term as an entrepreneur, how breaks give us space for self-reflection, and why we should sometimes slow down in making decisions. Towards the end of the episode, Arrel and I discussed strategies for how to take a break if you don't have a whole year to just relax, so make sure to stick around for that. Now, on to today's episode. Perfect. Thank you so much, Arrel, for being here. I want to also quickly shout out first Josh Shapiro, previous guest on How I Decide, for connecting the two of us and making the conversation happen. So in learning about your background, obviously you've started a few companies, been able to have some exits. More recently, you co-founded Wonderschool, which is helping teachers their own preschools, and currently you're also the head of product at Primer. But when we had a previous conversation, I think what really stood out to me is you talking about after Wonderschool going on this year-long break to Portugal. And I think that really stood out to me because I listen to a lot of different podcasts about entrepreneurs and their startups, and I'm sure there's a ton that we could talk about with regards to the companies that you founded and what you've learned from that. But in particular, I guess I wanted to start out with why Portugal and why travel after your time at Wonderschool.
My wife and I had always talked about going and living abroad, and we had 2 small kids at the time, but they were young enough that it seemed they were still pretty portable. They didn't really have friends or anything. They were 1 and 4, I think. And so it seemed like good timing with the fact that I was leaving Wonderschool, and my wife was a reporter at the NPR station in LA, and she was ready for a change too. So she took time off, and the reason we picked Portugal was we wanted somewhere where we could surf, because we both like to surf, and we wanted somewhere where we could practice our Spanish. And Portuguese was close enough, we figured. But it turns out we didn't realize Portuguese in Portugal is very different. The accent is just very different than it is in Brazil. It doesn't sound much like Spanish at all. It sounds more like a Slavic language. So most of the learning we did there was just like picking up the accent, which is pretty hard if you're not used to it. So the vocabulary is pretty similar in the conjugation and everything.
In your thought process for wanting to travel and stuff, were there any other things that you considered doing besides maybe say I'm going to take a year-long break? Like, were you tempted to maybe just go immediately start searching for your next venture, given that you've kind of had this history now of you started and exited companies?
I intentionally did not, and I was really worried that I would get very bored and feel like I was just wasting my time and Like I really wanted to get back into things. But then once we got into the swing of things, it was really great. I didn't realize I'd been, like you said, founded a few different companies and had exits of different levels. Nothing that was like a home run, retire early type of success. And I didn't realize, I think, how ground down I was. Like I was pretty burnt at that point. I had been grinding pretty hard for a decade at that point and recently had kids, and that kind of layers on top of it. So I think I didn't realize how ready I was for a break. And I didn't realize how helpful a break would be to just the way I thought about business and running my life in general. Like when you're in the weeds, it's really easy to lose focus on the bigger picture and the longer term vision of where you're going. You're just like fighting fires all the time, especially in early startups. And so taking that year off really gave me a lot more perspective and made me, I think, approach business different when I came back, which was really great.
I want to address this idea of not realizing that you needed to have a break, because being an entrepreneur is so busy, right? You have to wear all these different hats, put out these different fires. So as you've kind of gone about your journey of starting different companies, like how have you been able to pay attention, whether you felt you were pushing too hard, and how has that kind of changed over the years for you?
Yeah, I was definitely not good at that previously, because when you're at a startup, there's always a goal right in front of you that you're trying to hit. You're trying to hit some number or fix some problem or hire somebody. And so you always have very concrete goals that you're working towards in the near term. And at a startup, there's always more that you can focus on. And so it's easy to just keep putting one front foot in front of the other and focus on what's right in front of you and keep going in the right direction and course correcting and feeling like you're making progress all the time. So you feel like you can't take a break because there's always the next thing that you need to do. And so I actually, whenever I would go on shorter vacations, which is why I was worried about the longer one, sometimes if I really try to take a complete break from work, I feel like anxiety around it and get antsy. And I'm like, I'm just sitting here, I could be doing something productive because I know that I'm falling behind on what I'm working on. So that's why taking that time off and just really intentionally not working on anything. The first couple of weeks were tough, but it really changes your perspective. You just get that time to reflect and think about the past. Whereas when you're grinding, you think much more about what's happening right now and what you need to get to.
I guess what you're describing, like less space for reflection, because you just have so many goals and milestones that you want to reach and things that you have to do. Whereas when you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff, you're given kind of the headspace to look in the past and kind of learn and see from that. So I think that's really interesting. Would you describe yourself as someone who's they always need to be working? Was that something that you identified with in the past, say before you took on this longer break?
Yeah, I mean, not to extreme workaholic levels. I'm not like a 80, 100 hour a week type of worker. I can't really maintain that. But I definitely just needed that sense of productivity. I need to feel like I'm working on something meaningful and then I'm progressing in it and improving on something. And so that definitely that's just always running in the back of my head that needs to be. When I'm not doing that, I definitely feel guilty and like I'm doing something wrong.
Yeah, no, I've actually had a lot of conversations about that exact thing, feeling like you're not doing enough. And this was especially, I think, relevant for me. I talked about this a lot with my sister over COVID, which was just such a weird time for us. She was in, I think, her senior year of high school. I was in college at the time, and it just really felt like there was nothing going on. So it was what can I be doing, that sort of thing. But really, it's there wasn't really that much more. I guess we just kind of had to take care of our school, help out around the house and stuff. But I think, it didn't really occur to me that I didn't have to always just be doing more. I think people listening can definitely relate to, especially nowadays in college, where I feel like the peer-to-peer comparison is so tough these days. So you feel like it's that you should be doing more. And I'm sure it's kind of on the same level as well, with the founders and entrepreneurs that you might have known in your or building their own things as well. So I find it to be a really interesting topic. Wanted to also ask you as well, maybe you could share what a typical day was or week was for you and your family in Portugal, and how you decided to spend that time, and maybe how that developed throughout the year.
Well, the first thing was we found school for our kids so that they would, so we didn't have to parent all day. That was a major component of where we were going to go. So we definitely found a place where they could go to school and be with other kids and have a good time on their own. And in Portugal, it's a very family-oriented country, and so school lets out early, and so we still had a lot of time with family, but we always had like 5 to 6 hours a day of just getting to hang out with each other, which was great. And like I said, we wanted to work on language skills and on surfing, so we took language lessons, and we were definitely the only people taking language lessons that had no reason to. We were just like, thought it'd be fun. Everyone else there had moved to Portugal for work and was like trying to Portuguese to be able to function at work, and we were the weirdos there, just like nobody could figure out why we were there, but yeah, we were having a good time. And then we would just try to surf a lot of the time as well. Surfing's tiring, so we could only do an hour to 2 hours a day, and usually did it like 3 or 4 times a week, but definitely did that. And then just try to read a lot and write in my journal. I'm not a big PowerPoint person, but I started a PowerPoint, like a Google slide, going over like what happened at Wonderschool, what I did well, what I did wrong, what I would have done different. And it was fun to do that in the first couple of weeks after I left. And there was a lot of emotion in leaving something that you had started, and seeing how that presentation changed over time as I got more perspective and like changed how I thought about what I was doing and what I could have done different and what I was doing well. And you really, as you have that time to reflect, it really changes your perspective on whose fault things are and where you should put your time and your effort moving forward too. It's easier I think it's hard to see your shortcomings in the moment because you're so focused on what you need to be working on. I guess what I felt like I was lacking was a lack of perspective. And so I think most of the reflection was realizing how short-term focused I was on everything. And when you are short-term focused, you can't accomplish the big things. And so I think that was a lot of the reason why I ended up leaving Wonderschool, because I couldn't kind of break out of that box of thinking just very short-term.
And do you think this is like an exercise that you would recommend to everyone, say like they're moving on from a previous role to kind of, I don't know if they prefer to do it in the Google slide, PowerPoint style, but just like some sort of organized reflection, or you even have maybe like a framework structure that you follow for it?
Yeah, it was pretty fluid, but I would definitely recommend doing it. And the nice thing about something like a PowerPoint deck is that you can see the changes you're making really easily. If you're writing things out in paragraphs and pages, you kind of have to go back and read everything. The nice thing about PowerPoint is you can have like the big idea takeaways one after another. And so then you can see like, oh, in version 1, these are my takeaways. And then in version 2, they kind of shifted a little bit. And by version 5, it was like totally different set of takeaways of things I would do different and learnings. And I thought that was really interesting. And there was some consistency through it, but it was definitely enlightening. And just, I think what I've taken from that is I kind of make decisions a little more slowly now, and I'll think about what the decision I would make. And then if it's not urgent, if it doesn't have to be made today, wait a little while and then reconsider it in a day or two or next week. And sometimes that changes as you kind of simmer up on it and think about what the other options are.
Yeah, I actually really like that idea. It's like, we don't, if there's not an urgent deadline or anything, we don't have to rush into things. And it's funny, like I actually think about what you just said about decision making. I think about it the same way for writing and stuff. So like writing on my blog and stuff is like, I'm just writing for myself, so no one ever has any hard deadline for me. But if I just kind of feeling a little stuck, just maybe take some time off. And then usually like as soon as I look at it again and in a few days or even the next day, it's just like there's an idea that pops out that kind of just like with time, you just see something in a different way. For the other activities that you're doing, say like surfing or languages, did you feel fulfillment for that, in that these are things that you could have focused or spend more time on now that you maybe didn't have time to spend on in the past several years?
Yeah, I think knowing that it was going to end helped a little bit. If I was actually retired and that was what I was going to do with the rest of my life, I'm not sure that it would have been as fulfilling. But knowing that there's like you're doing it for a year and you're probably going to get back into something after that, yeah, it was amazing. And I could have gone longer too. Actually, we intended to go longer, but COVID hit during that, and so we moved back to the U.S. We intended to just move back for like a month or two until COVID blew over, but now we're still here. COVID took a while to leave and is still here too.
Yeah, I do want to get back to this idea of what you were talking about, like the added perspective you got in Portugal. And it sounds like we've touched a little bit upon it. It's like reflections on work and startups and stuff. But are there any concrete takeaways that you think about now that you were kind of able to realize during your break there that you kind of try to apply now that you maybe didn't have before?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway was just not to rush things. I was always in a rush before to finish this project. So the next one, to hire this person. Like Silicon Valley is just a very fast paced place, and everyone's always getting the next milestone as fast as possible. And a lot of people are addicted to their TikTok or their Instagram feed, and a lot of that's driven by FOMO. I think for me, like the LinkedIn FOMO is as cringy as the LinkedIn feed can be. There's definitely FOMO there of like everyone's like succeeding at something, they're launching something new, or they just raised another round, and you feel like you're constantly behind. And so you're always in a rush to like make sure we hit some number by some date, but then trying to just take more time to make decisions and not be in a rush just really makes a big difference. I think it's easy to make a decision and then jump into execution, and then make the next decision and jump into the execution time. And once you're executing, you feel like I'm productive, I'm doing something positive, I'm working towards the decision I made. But actually taking more time to make the decision is a much higher leverage activity.
So in that time that you're taking more time to make that decision, like how are you usually spending that time? Is it just giving more breaks in between that you're not really thinking about it, or is it something else that you're doing?
I just make sure to have space in my day every day to not have to work on something specific. And I'll just write for a while, or I'll do some research online of something that is relevant to what I'm working on. And so I always have these projects going that I have executional work to do, but I always make sure to have a block every day, really, to just have some space to think about it and not feel like I need to execute on it.
Yeah. I've actually, you talking about the pace of Silicon Valley just made me think about this, but I've always heard that and maybe like European countries, like the pace of life is slower. Would you say that's true after having been there?
Yeah, definitely. Portugal has a very much slower pace of life, definitely. Yeah, they're not in a rush
Yeah.
to do much of anything, which is great. I mean, they see like it's such a welcoming country, and it seems like it's just a great place to live. And I think that's probably a lot of what makes that.
Yeah.
Is that it's that pace of life. Everyone makes time for things.
Yeah. I think really interesting to observe, like whenever I guess people do go and see what that's like, it's like pretty shocking actually just to see people have that kind of a different idea of work-life balance and what that means in terms of hours and what you do and stuff. When you guys eventually did move back to the US, how were you feeling about doing something new? Like, were you eager to get working again? Did you feel like kind of fresh, like you had just came back from this break and you were ready to go after again? Where was your head at that time?
Yeah, but then I was definitely starting to feel like I wanted to work on something. So we were almost a year in at that point, when it was like 10 or 11 months. And I was definitely ready to start something new. I wasn't in a rush. And so I ended up advising some startups and talking with friends and trying to figure out the next thing to work on, which was, again, nice to not feel like I had to rush into anything. But I was definitely ready. Yeah.
I guess on this point of rushing into stuff and particularly like being a founder in startups, like why do you think maybe other people that were like in your position or people who can relate to this idea of having to execute, like why do you think this is a problem for people? Is it kind of just baked into the culture of startups, or why do you think people feel this pressure to always be rushing into things?
I think with startups, at least, it feels like the clock is always ticking. You've got some money in the bank, and it's going down every day. In general, most startups are not making money, you're losing money. And you're trying to get to that next milestone where you can raise more money so that you don't run out. And so you're always in a race against the clock, which just makes you feel that time pressure. The problem is that the clock is usually a year or more the runway you have. And so even though it's easy to succumb to the pressure of like, oh my God, we got to hit the milestone this quarter so that we're lined up for the one next quarter so that by next fall we'll be able to raise around. And so you back into these short-term goals that you feel like you have to focus on. And it feels like if you miss this one in front of you, there's going to be a cascade and you're not going to be able to make it up in the future. But the reality is that just having better decision-making and thinking more long-term from the beginning sets you up better for that longer term, for hitting your longer term goals, because you won't get painted into a corner. I ended up making shorter term decisions a lot of the time that then you get stuck and you're like, I don't know what the next step should be at this point. And now you have to make another quick decision because you feel behind because something didn't go exactly according to plan. And so if you can break out of that thinking and put more options on the table and not necessarily commit to one option right away and explore a little more, it really gives you're just getting to place more bets instead of like, I think previously I would just make my bet and then go after it as hard as I could and then make the next bet.
Yeah, no, I mean, all of this is super interesting to me. I've been kind of doing my own exploration with decision making as like the science and stuff, and all of that I think is super helpful, right? Like adding additional options, because that gives you, I think, a better chances of succeeding at making the best choice that you can then execute on. Something I wanted to ask you, I think might be helpful for people listening, is you've taken this year-long break to Portugal, and that's given you a lot of perspective on work and life. If someone is, say, also maybe feeling a little burnt out from their role, or also just kind of maybe struggling with what they're doing right now, what do you think people can do to take a step back or take a break if, say, maybe financially they couldn't afford to not be working for an entire year? What do you think would also be useful alternatives that would maybe also achieve what you were able to experience?
Yeah, well, I do know that in the past, if I've ever had a break, you feel just like in the pressure in a startup. If you are on a break, you feel the pressure to like figure out where you're going to do next. So if you do end up taking a break, just make sure to set a deadline for not working through that, not feeling pressure until that deadline hits. Like even if it's just 2 weeks, you're like, all right, I just left my job. I'm going to take 2 weeks and like not look for a job intentionally for 2 weeks. And then I can start looking for a job. Because once you start looking, that pressure starts to build and you feel like you're doing something wrong. And that intentional decision of like, I'm not even going to engage in work really makes a big difference. Because if you start to let it creep in, at least for me, I can't stop it. Like it's going to take over. But I think you can do that with weekends as well. Like I know especially in the founder role, you feel like weekends you should be working as well. And so Friday night, you'll be like, all right, tomorrow I'll get up and I'll knock out these few things I need to work on, and I can relax in the afternoon. And the morning comes and you're like, I'm not quite ready to work on that. I'm going to do something else first. And then in the afternoon, I'll work on it. And you just start pushing this out and like doing little by little all throughout the weekend. And you end up like stressed all weekend because you feel like you were supposed to do some of this stuff Saturday morning and you ended up waiting longer. And so the same thing, even if it's just a weekend or a 3-day weekend or taking a day off work, like just block off time to not do anything and make sure you don't feel guilty about it. Like that sense of guilt is just so overriding for, I think, a lot of founders. Like that's what drives you. I think it's good to have that guilt. That really drives you and makes you work harder, but it's also poisonous if you let it take over.
So it sounds like setting hard boundaries to say, I'm not going to be doing this, or I'm not going to think about it, is going just a way to kind of mentally, that temptation of wanting to think about everything that you have to do and add.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm not big on work-life balance. I don't think your work and the rest of your life should be balanced. I think there are phases where you should just work like hell, and there are phases where you should relax and not work. And that's how our systems work. Like you need exercise, you need recovery. And I feel like it's the same with work. And when you're a founder, it's so hard to get out of the recovery phase and just feel like even when you're relaxing, you need to be doing some work in the background. But having that recovery phase is really huge. And if you can have a recovery phase for a year, it's amazing.
Really hope you guys enjoyed today's show with Arrel Gray. It was a really great conversation for me, I think, especially because a lot of us are working so hard, so focused on our goals and stuff. This idea of burnout, which obviously I have no experience to speak upon because I'm still in school, but this idea of burnout really creeping up on you if you're just always looking to grind out the next milestone, I think is something I really took away from our conversation. And hopefully I'll be able to find more guests that are able to share perspectives on this topic. So thank you so much for listening. Be sure to follow the How I Decide podcast on Instagram, and looking forward to the next episode.